I finally blew up at my Baka sister thanks to her Baka husband. There's me 31M, the brother in this scenario, the one who spent the better part of my adult life trying to hold my family together while navigating the pitfalls of my sister's marriage. Then there's my sister Jane, 34F, who has always been my best friend, my closest family member growing up. We had each other's backs, always. But things have changed. And finally, we have her husband, Ben 36M, the antagonist of this story, the man who, for years, has cast a shadow over our family. This is a story about how I blew up, how my years of patience, understanding, and biting my tongue came crashing down in one single, explosive moment. Jane and I were inseparable growing up. Being only 3 years apart, we shared everything, inside jokes, late-night talks, and the unspoken understanding that we were each other's support system. We were raised in a family that wasn't exactly the picture of stability. Our parents fought often, and the emotional tension in the house was palpable. But Jane and I, we were like our own little unit within that chaos. We always talked about how, no matter what happened in life, we would be there for each other. And for the most part, we kept that promise. But things changed after she met Ben. Ben came into the picture when Jane was in her mid-20s. At first, I was happy for her. She seemed to really care about him, and I wanted her to be happy. But as I got to know Ben, little red flags began to appear. At first, they were small things, comments he'd make that rubbed me the wrong way, subtle put-downs aimed at Jane or even me. He had this arrogance about him, a sense that he was always right, always smarter than everyone else in the room. I didn't like him, but I kept my mouth shut because Jane seemed happy. As their relationship got more serious, things started to change between me and Jane. She became more distant, less willing to hang out or have those heart-to-heart talks we used to have. I figured it was just the natural progression of life. She had a boyfriend, then a fiancé, and eventually a husband, but something felt off. The real issues started after they got married. Ben's behavior became more overtly controlling. He made decisions for them without consulting Jane, and whenever she tried to assert herself, he'd belittle her. It became clear that Ben didn't just want to be Jane's husband, he wanted to control every aspect of her life. And as much as I tried to stay out of it, to let them work things out on their own, I couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on my sister. Jane started calling me less. When we did talk, she seemed anxious, like she was always walking on eggshells. Whenever Ben came up in conversation, I could hear the stress in her voice. I'd ask her if she was okay, if she needed to talk, but she always brushed it off. "I'm fine," she'd say. "It's just how he is. I'm used to it." That phrase, "I'm used to it," broke my heart every time. But what could I do? She was an adult, and it wasn't my place to interfere in her marriage. So, I stayed silent. Things came to a head about 2 years into their marriage. Ben had always been a bit of a control freak, but this was the first time it affected me directly. It was a family gathering, one of those rare moments where we all get together, pretend to be a happy family, and make small talk over dinner. I was in the middle of a conversation with Jane when Ben suddenly interrupted, telling her that it was time for them to leave. Jane looked surprised and said she wasn't ready to go yet, but Ben didn't care. He insisted, and Jane, visibly uncomfortable, stood up to follow him out. That moment might not seem like much, but it was a turning point for me. I saw the look in Jane's eyes, this mix of resignation and fear, and it made my blood boil. After they left, I sat there, fuming, trying to keep my emotions in check. Why was she letting him treat her like that? Why wasn't she standing up for herself? And more importantly, why did it feel like she was slipping away from me? I called her the next day to ask if she was okay, and she downplayed the whole thing. "He was just tired," she said. "He didn't mean anything by it." I knew it wasn't the whole truth, but I let it go. Again, as time went on, Ben's behavior became even more toxic. He would criticize Jane in front of family, belittle her opinions, and make her feel small. He was passive-aggressive toward me too, always making snide remarks about my life, my choices, and even my relationship with Jane. It was like he resented the fact that Jane and I had once been so close. I wanted to confront him, to tell him to back off, but I knew it wouldn't help. If anything, it would probably make things worse for Jane, so I kept my mouth shut, trying to be supportive from the sidelines, hoping that Jane would eventually see Ben for who he really was and leave him. But she didn't. Instead, she seemed to be sinking deeper into this toxic relationship, losing herself more and more each day. And every time I tried to talk to her about it, she would get defensive, telling me I didn't understand, that I was overreacting. I'm not sure when exactly I reached my breaking point, but it had been building for years. Maybe it was the cumulative effect of watching my sister, the person I'd always been closest to, fade into the background of her own life. Maybe it was the constant disrespect from Ben, the way he treated me like I was the problem, like I was the one intruding on their perfect life. Or maybe it was just the fact that I couldn't stand by any longer and watch someone I love be treated so poorly. The final straw came about a month ago. Jane and Ben had invited me over for dinner, something that rarely happened because Ben and I couldn't stand each other, and Jane usually tried to avoid putting us in the same room. But she had insisted this time, and I agreed, hoping maybe things had improved. It started out fine enough. We made small talk, ate dinner, and everything seemed relatively normal. But then Ben started making his usual passive-aggressive comments, this time about how I wasn't married yet, how I couldn't possibly understand the dynamics of a marriage since I was still single. I bit my tongue, as I had done countless times before, trying not to escalate things. But then he said something that hit a nerve. He made a comment about how I was always around, always inserting myself into their lives, as if I couldn't let Jane live her own life without my interference. That was it. That was the moment I snapped. I don't remember the exact words that came out of my mouth, but I remember the feeling. Years of pent-up frustration, anger, and sadness all came pouring out in a torrent of words. I told Ben that his behavior wasn't my fault, that I wasn't the one ruining Jane's life, he was. I told him that he was controlling, manipulative, and that he treated Jane like she was his property, not his wife. And then I turned to Jane. The part that hurt the most was finally saying out loud what I had been thinking for years, that I couldn't understand why she was letting him do this to her. I told her that I missed my sister, the person she used to be before Baka Ben came along, and that it broke my heart to see her so unhappy. I told her that I had tried for years to be patient, to let her figure things out on her own, but I couldn't sit by any longer and watch her be miserable. There was a long silence after I finished. Jane just stared at me, her face a mix of shock, hurt, and anger. Ben, of course, tried to turn it around on me, calling me disrespectful and accusing me of overstepping my bounds. But for once, I didn't care. I didn't care if I was crossing a line or if I was making things worse. I had spent too long biting my tongue, and I was done. Jane didn't speak to me for a couple of weeks after that. I had expected it. In fact, I wasn't sure if she would ever speak to me again. Part of me wondered if I had made a huge mistake by blowing up like that, if I had pushed her further away by confronting her in such an aggressive way. But deep down, I knew it had been building for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, it was what she needed to hear. Eventually, Jane reached out. We met for coffee, and for the first time in years, we had a real conversation. She told me that she was hurt by what I had said, but she also admitted that a lot of it was true. She said she had been struggling for a long time, feeling trapped in a marriage that wasn't what she had hoped for, but she didn't know how to get out. Ben had isolated her from her friends, and she felt like she had no one to turn to. That conversation was the first step in what I hope will be a long process of healing, for both of us. Jane hasn't left Ben, at least not yet, but I think she's starting to see things more clearly. She's started going to therapy, and we've been talking more regularly. It's going to take time, but I have hope that she find her way back to herself. Blowing up at my sister was one of the hardest things I've ever done. For years, I had tried to avoid confrontation, to keep the peace, to let her figure things out on her own. But at some point, the anger and sadness I felt about the situation became too much to bear. I couldn't stand by any longer and watch her be mistreated by someone who claimed to love her. It wasn't easy, and it hasn't been pretty, but I don't regret it. Sometimes, you have to be the one to say the hard things, even if it means risking your relationship. Because at the end of the day, I love my sister. And I couldn't watch her lose herself any longer.